6 brides, 6 wedding nights, 6 funerals before sunrise. The bells of St. Augustine's Cathedral had barely stopped ringing before London society began placing wagers on how long the Duke's newest bride would survive. Some predicted 5 hours. Others, feeling generous, offered 6. No one predicted dawn, yet as morning sunlight spilled gold across the windows of Ravenshaw Manor, Clara Winslow slept soundly in the arms of the most feared man in England. For 7 years, every bride of Duke Sebastian Ravenshaw had died before sunrise. No constable had ever proven a charge against him. No physician had ever written down the true cause of death. Society had simply stopped asking questions and started keeping score instead. Tonight, the 7th survived, and somewhere within the cold stone walls of Ravenshaw Manor, someone who had built a perfect, invisible plan for 7 long years felt it crack for the very first time. Greetings, noble viewers, and welcome to Forbidden Palace. I trust this day finds you well and in excellent spirits, wherever in the world you may be sitting as this tale begins. As we journey toward the grand milestone of 1,000 subscribers, your support is humbly requested. If you find delight in tales of mystery, romance, scandal, and unforgettable characters, we ask that you subscribe to the channel, leave a like upon this video, and become part of our growing circle of distinguished viewers. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, from which corner of the world do you watch tonight? And what hour does the clock strike in your land at this very moment? We do love to greet our company properly. Every subscription, every like, and every thoughtful comment helps keep these stories alive, and for that, we offer our sincere and lasting gratitude. Now, without further delay, let us return to Ravenshaw Manor and to the bride who lived. Clara Winslow opened her eyes to soft grey morning light and lay still for a long moment, listening to her own heartbeat with something close to disbelief. She was alive. Not faint, not fevered, not cold in the particular way the London papers always described the Duke's previous brides the morning after. She was simply, ordinarily, completely alive, with her cheek resting against the bare chest of the man beside her, and his arm settled loosely around her shoulders, as though it had always belonged there. Sebastian Ravenshaw had not moved in nearly an hour. He had lain awake the entire night, rigid with a vigilance he could not explain even to himself, watching the rise and fall of his new wife's breathing, the way a starving man watches food he does not yet trust himself to touch. 6 times before, he had lain in this same bed beside a woman who would not see the morning. He had learned, across 7 terrible years, not to hope. Hope had only ever made the mornings crueler. And yet here was Clara, stirring against him, blinking up with sleep-heavy hazel eyes, entirely and stubbornly alive. "You're staring at me, Your Grace," she said, "as though I have grown a second head in the night." "Forgive me," Sebastian said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I find myself rather fixated on the fact that you are breathing." "I should hope so. It is generally considered good manners." Below them, the household had already begun to gather outside the bedchamber door, drawn by nothing but old dread and the certainty that this morning would require, as every morning before it had, a hastily summoned undertaker. When the door opened from within, and the new Duchess herself stood there, very much upright, and asking after breakfast, the housekeeper, a stout and steady woman named Mrs. Higgins, very nearly dropped the tray in her hands. "Your Grace," Mrs. Higgins managed, staring at Clara as though she might vanish if examined too closely. "You are entirely well." "Entirely well," Clara confirmed. "And quite hungry. Is there tea, or must I requisition it myself?" Word of the 7th Duchess's survival travelled through Ravenshaw Manor faster than any fire could have spread it. By midday, half the staff had invented some excuse to pass her door, simply to see with their own eyes what no one in the house had dared to hope for in 7 years. That evening, While Clara had stepped out to walk the long gallery and clear her head, a folded note appeared beneath her chamber door. It carried no signature, only 6 words in a careful, deliberate hand. You were not meant to wake. Clara read it twice, folded it small enough to slip inside her glove, and decided, for reasons she could not entirely explain even to herself, that she would not yet show it to her husband. She had married him for the plainest reason a clever, desperate woman ever marries anyone. Because her father's modest estate in Hertfordshire had run out of every honest way of feeding itself, and because a duke's offer, however terrifying its reputation, settled debts that grief alone could never touch. Her younger sister, Mary, was 16 and still believed in fairness. Her younger brother, William, was 11 and still believed, with the simple confidence of a boy who had not yet been disappointed enough times, that their family's fortunes might somehow mend themselves. Their father, a respected but financially ruined scholar named Mr. Edmund Winslow, had died believing the same thing, which Clara often thought was the only true inheritance he had left her, a stubborn, foolish hope that refused to die even when every ledger in the house argued otherwise. Society had warned her, of course, at every turn. At the small gathering where the match was first announced, no fewer than 4 respectable matrons had drawn her aside to whisper some version of the same warning. "Run, child," one had said, gripping Clara's wrist with surprising strength. There is still time before the banns are read. There had not been time. There had been a roof that leaked over Mary's bed, a tutor for William who had not been paid in 2 quarters, and a family name that would not survive one more season of polite, devastating pity. What Clara had not expected, arriving at Ravenshaw Manor resigned to her own funeral, was a husband who flinched faintly at the sound of his own front door closing, who took most of his meals alone, not from cruelty but from long, lonely habit, and who, on their second evening together, had quietly moved an entire card table across the drawing room so that she would not have to sit near a window he claimed, without quite meeting her eyes, had an unpleasant draught. It was not love, not yet. It was something stranger and slower than that. The cautious, suspicious astonishment of 2 people who had each expected the very worst from the world, discovering instead that they had been handed something neither of them quite knew how to hold without breaking it. She wrote to William every week, careful never to let her letters carry any of the worry she felt, describing instead the impossible size of the Ravenshaw stables and the even more impossible temper of a goose that had taken up residence near the kitchen garden. William wrote back with the blunt honesty only an 11-year-old possesses, once asking outright, "Is it true he killed 6 wives, Clara? The boys in the village say there are bones beneath the manor." She had laughed aloud reading it, then written back simply that there were no bones beneath the manor, only a great deal of very old wine and one extremely opinionated goose, and that William should tell the boys in the village they had been reading far too many penny papers. When she read Sebastian the letter, expecting him to laugh as she had, he did not. He sat very still for a long moment, and then said, quietly, "Tell him there are no bones. Tell him also that I am glad someone finally asked outright, rather than simply believing it and saying nothing." It was, Clara thought afterward, the first time she had seen him grateful for an insult, simply because, at last, it had been spoken where a man might actually answer it. Mary arrived for a fortnight's visit not long after, 16, and curious about everything, and within a single afternoon had charmed nearly the entire household, including, much to everyone's surprise, the head gardener and his long-suffering goose. She found Clara in the garden one evening and asked, with the particular bluntness only a younger sister dares, "Are you happy here? Truly. You may tell me plainly. I shan't repeat it to anyone, not even William." Clara considered the question with more care than she gave most things. "I think I am becoming happy," she said finally. "It did not feel that way at first. At first it felt like holding my breath and waiting to see whether the air here was safe to breathe at all. But I find I have stopped holding my breath, somewhere along the way, without quite noticing when it happened. He looks at you the way father used to look at his books, Mary said, as though he cannot quite believe something so good was simply allowed to exist in his own house. Clara laughed, surprised into it. That is, I believe, the strangest and kindest thing anyone has ever said about either of us. I have always been observant, Mary said primly, and then ruined the effect entirely by shrieking and running for the house, the gardener's goose having chosen that exact moment to take a sudden and personal interest in the hem of her gown. The east wing of the manor had been locked since long before Clara's arrival, and no servant in the house would say precisely why, though several crossed themselves quietly whenever they passed its heavy oak door. She discovered this the practical way, trying the handle herself on a rainy Tuesday out of nothing more than ordinary curiosity, and finding it would not turn. "That wing belonged to the late Duchess, Your Grace," said Mr. Percival Finch, the Duke's valet, appearing behind her with the silent timing of a man who had clearly been keeping half an eye on that particular door for years. He was lean, sharp-witted, with quick, observant eyes, and a dry humor that surfaced at the most unexpected moments. His Grace's mother, that is. He has not opened it since she passed, nor permitted anyone else to. "And the 6 who came after her?" Clara asked. "Where did they live, before the end?" Finch's expression flickered with something complicated. "Their own chambers, Your Grace, in the main wing, the very rooms you now occupy. Their belongings were sent home to their families afterward, every stitch, with the Duke's own letters of apology enclosed. He insisted on writing each one himself. Took him the better part of a fortnight, every single time." That, Clara thought, was not the behavior of a murderer. Murderers, in her admittedly limited experience of novels and gossip columns, did not spend fortnights composing careful letters of apology to grieving families. She asked Mrs. Higgins more directly whether any of the previous duchesses had kept diaries or correspondence of their own. "The 4th Duchess kept a diary, Your Grace, I believe," Mrs. Higgins said, her hands stilling on the linen she was folding. "Whether it survived her, I could not say. Such things were never my place to ask after, once the family had finished grieving." "And was it Lady Margaret who saw to packing their belongings, each time?" Clara asked, recalling something Finch had mentioned in passing. Mrs. Higgins hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Lady Margaret offered, out of kindness, every time. His Grace could never bear to do it himself. We all thought it a mercy that she should spare him the task." Clara filed the detail away without quite understanding yet why it mattered, the way one notices a crooked picture frame long before realizing the wall behind it is cracked. That night, Dr. Frederick Holloway, the family physician who had attended every Ravenshaw bride for nearly 2 decades, recommended she take a small tonic for her nerves, given the natural strain of a new household. She thanked him kindly. She did not take the tonic. She mentioned the encounter to Sebastian that evening, watching his face carefully. He set down his fork entirely. "Holloway has attended this family since before my own birth. I have never once questioned his judgment." He paused, something shifting behind his eyes. "Perhaps that is precisely the trouble, Clara. I have questioned nothing in this house in 7 years. I learned only to grieve quietly, and let others manage every detail." "Then perhaps it is time someone questioned a few of those details," Clara said, "starting with a tonic I have now been warned away from twice, by someone who has not yet shown their face." That night a second note found her, slipped into the lining of her cloak. 3 words only: "Trust no physician." The London papers, never ones to let a happy ending slow them down, found a new angle within the week. "The 7th miracle," one headline announced, as though Clara were a relic rather than a person, while another, considerably less charitable, suggested the Duke had simply grown more careful in his methods. Lady Violet Pennington, Clara's oldest and most loyal friend, arrived at Ravenshaw Manor entirely unannounced, with a trunk, a sharp tongue, and absolutely no patience for gossip of any kind. "They are calling you either a saint or a fool, depending which paper you read," Violet announced, dropping into a chair without waiting to be invited. I told Lady Dunmore that you were neither, and that if she repeated her theory about poisoned wedding cake within my hearing again, I would repeat several things I happen to know about her husband's gaming debts. Violet. I would not actually have said it. Probably. Violet's expression softened. Are you well, truly? Forget the papers. Forget him for one moment. Are you well? Clara considered the question honestly, which was the only way she had ever known how to answer Violet. I am frightened, she admitted, and I am curious, and the two together feel rather like standing too close to a cliff's edge on a windy afternoon. But I do not believe Sebastian means me harm. I believe someone wants very badly for me to think that he does. It was Violet, 2 days later, paging restlessly through old society columns out of sheer boredom, who found the detail that made Clara go very still. A small, half-buried mention from 11 years past, of a fire at a neighboring estate, and the name of the family who had lost everything in it. The Ashcombs. Violet found it almost by accident, between an advertisement for hair tonic and a notice of a horse sale, a brief paragraph noting that the Ashcombe estate near Dunmore had suffered a catastrophic fire 11 years prior, claiming the life of Mr. Henry Ashcombe and leaving his widow, Lady Margaret Ashcombe, in the care of close family friends, the Ravenshaws. The Ravenshaws, Clara repeated slowly. That is Sebastian's own family. It is, Violet said, setting the column down with unusual care. And it says here, the fire began on land. The Ashcombes had been disputing with the Ravenshaws for years. Clara, I do not like the shape this is taking. Neither do I, Clara admitted. But a disputed boundary and an old grief are not proof of murder, however much they may explain the shape of one. No, Violet agreed quietly, but they are certainly proof that someone in this house has carried a wound for 11 years that no one ever thought to ask about. Clara folded the newspaper column carefully into her writing case, beside the 2 notes she still had not shown her husband, and tried, without much success, to convince herself that curiosity was the same thing as caution. A week later, Sebastian insisted they travel to London together. If only, he said, to let society see for itself that you are not a ghost. They may print whatever they please about. The visit did little to settle Clara's nerves. At a small soiree hosted by Lady Dunmore herself, conversation halted entirely the moment they entered the room, and Clara felt every eye in the house assessing her the way one might assess a horse at auction, searching for some hidden flaw that would explain her survival. They are waiting for you to collapse mid-conversation, I believe, Violet murmured, appearing at Clara's elbow with 2 glasses of lemonade. Purely so they may have something fresh to discuss over breakfast tomorrow. How encouraging, Clara said. I find it rather encouraging myself. It means they have nothing real to hold against either of you, only old fear dressed up as gossip. Violet studied the room a moment longer. Though I notice Lady Margaret has not once taken her eyes from you since we arrived. Clara turned, and found it true. Across the crowded room, Margaret Ashcombe stood near the refreshment table in deep plum silk, smiling warmly at whoever addressed her, and watching Clara with an attention that did not match the smile at all. Perhaps she is simply relieved, Clara said carefully, that I am well. Perhaps, Violet agreed, in a tone that suggested she believed nothing of the sort. Romance, when it finally arrived, did not announce itself with declarations. It arrived in small, almost embarrassing increments. Sebastian teaching Clara to identify hawks from the library window, badly, because he was no better at it than she was. Clara catching him smiling at something Finch had said, and pretending, quite unconvincingly, not to have noticed. Both of them laughing until they had to sit down on the same overstuffed settee over an incident involving the kitchen garden goose and the head gardener's wig. You realize, Clara said one evening, the fire burning low and the room pleasantly warm, that all of London believes you a murderer of the very worst order, and here you are, thoroughly defeated by a goose. I have been defeated by far less, Sebastian said. "I was once soundly outwitted at draughts by a 6-year-old. I do not recommend the experience to anyone." "Was the 6-year-old you?" I declined to answer, on the grounds that it may incriminate me. It was a small joke, but it landed somewhere old and tender in her chest, because watching him, she understood that this dry, careful humor was not a performance staged for her benefit. It was simply what remained of him after 7 years of being treated as a monster, a man who had quietly decided that if he could not be loved, he could at least be amusing enough that no one noticed how lonely he had truly become. "I did not kill them," he said suddenly, not looking at her. "Any of them. I want you to know that plainly, not as a comfort, but as a fact, whatever it costs you to believe it." "I know," Clara said. "I have known since the second evening, when you moved an entire card table across a room, rather than let me sit near a draft that did not exist." He looked at her. Then, as though she had said something extraordinary, and perhaps, to a man who had not truly been believed by anyone in 7 years, she had. Clara began her search in the one place no one had thought to forbid her, the small family chapel, where each of the 6 former duchesses had a modest memorial plaque, and where, tucked behind the 4th one, she found a slim leather diary belonging to a gentle woman named Charlotte Pell, who had died only 7 months into her marriage. The diary's final pages were not the ramblings of a frightened bride. They were precise, almost clinical, the careful work of a woman who had begun to suspect her own nightly tonic. "I have not taken the wine Dr. Holloway prepares for me these past 3 nights, Charlotte had written. "I find myself considerably clearer for it. I intend to ask Lady Margaret why she insists upon bringing it to me herself, when it is not otherwise her custom to attend to such small matters." Clara read the entry 4 times before the name fully settled in her mind. Lady Margaret Ashcombe, the late Duchess's closest friend, a fixture of Ravenshaw Manor for as long as anyone in the household could remember, trusted enough to come and go from any room in the house, including, it now seemed, the sick rooms of brides who never recovered. She brought the diary to Finch before she brought it to Sebastian, uncertain, for reasons she could not yet name, whether she trusted her own judgment enough to act on it alone. Finch read the page twice, his quick fingers tightening on the worn leather cover. "Lady Margaret has nursed every duchess through her wedding night fatigue since I first entered service here, Your Grace. It was always considered a kindness. No one thought to question a grieving widow's devotion to a household that had taken her in as family. And no one thought to question why every woman she nursed afterward died," Clara said quietly. "No," Finch agreed, and for the first time since Clara had known him, his usual composure slipped entirely. "God forgive us all, Your Grace. No one did." The final entry in Charlotte's diary was dated 2 days before her death, and contained only a single unfinished line. "I believe I understand now what truly happened to." The page ended there. Clara closed the diary very carefully, aware, for the first time since her own wedding night, of exactly how much danger she might already be standing in. She brought the diary to Sebastian that night, and watched the color drain from his face as he read Charlotte's final, unfinished words. "Margaret," he said, as though tasting something bitter. "She has been a guest in this house since before I could properly walk. My mother loved her like a sister. Your mother's friend lost her husband in a fire 11 years ago," Clara said carefully, remembering Violet's discovery. "On the Ashcombe estate. Was Lady Margaret there?" Sebastian's jaw tightened. "Her husband died in that fire. Margaret survived it. She has never fully recovered. Not in body. And I had always believed, not entirely in spirit either, though I assumed her grief was simply honest sorrow." "What if it was honest sorrow?" Clara said slowly. "And what if it simply went somewhere terrible afterward?" They brought Finch into the conversation that same night, and it was Finch, turning the matter over with the same careful attention he gave to ink stains and missing cufflinks, who remembered something small. "Lady Margaret asked me, Your Grace, some weeks before your wedding, whether I thought the new bride would survive longer than the others. I thought it an odd, rather morbid question at the time. I confess, I did not think further on it until now. A second note arrived for Clara that same week, this one far less gentle than the others. It was found pinned to her pillow, and it carried no warning at all, only a single pressed flower, the same pale variety that had been laid, Clara later learned, upon the coffin of every Ravenshaw bride before her. Violet, summoned urgently, arrived within 2 days and listened to the entire account without once interrupting, which Clara had never known her capable of. "You must tell the magistrate," Violet said finally. "Today, not tomorrow." "And say what, precisely?" "That a grieving widow once asked a valet an odd question, and that someone left a flower on my pillow. Lady Margaret has dined at half the great houses in England. No magistrate will move against her on the strength of a diary entry and a dried flower, not without considerably more." "Then we find more," Violet said, already reaching for her gloves. "I did not travel 2 days in a draughty carriage to watch you reason your way calmly into a coffin." "Clara Winslow." "Ravenshaw," Clara corrected, with a small, tired smile. "It's Ravenshaw now." "Then certainly not to watch a duchess reason her way into one. The title only makes the prospect worse." Clara understood, looking at the flower again that night, that whoever had been warning her was running out of patience, and whoever had been hunting her was running out of time. The second attempt came only days later, quiet enough that it might easily have gone unnoticed. Clara had taken to drinking a small cup of warm milk each evening, a habit from childhood that helped her sleep, prepared faithfully by a kitchen maid and carried up by whoever happened to be passing the stairs. One evening, the cup tasted faintly bitter beneath the sweetness, wrong enough that Clara set it down untouched and asked Finch, on instinct alone, to have it examined. Finch returned the following morning, his usual composure entirely gone. "The apothecary in the village confirms it, Your Grace. There was a tincture in the milk, enough to bring on a deep and dangerous sleep, though not, he believes, enough on its own to kill outright. Someone is growing careless, or perhaps simply impatient." "Who carried the cup to my door that night?" Clara asked, already dreading the answer. "Sally, the under-housemaid. A good, honest girl, Your Grace. I would stake my own position on it. But she tells me she left the tray unattended for some minutes outside the still-room, while she fetched fresh linens at Lady Margaret's own request." Clara felt the cold certainty settle fully into place. It was no longer a suspicion built from old letters and an unfinished diary entry. It was a pattern, repeating itself in real time, aimed directly at her. "We must move carefully," Sebastian said, when she told him that evening, his hand closing tightly over hers. "If we accuse her without proof enough to satisfy a magistrate, she will simply vanish, or worse, finish what she started before we can stop her." "Then we find the proof," Clara said. "I believe I know precisely where to look." The East Wing's old lock finally yielded to Finch's careful patience on a grey afternoon, while Sebastian had ridden out to the tenant farms, and Clara, against every sensible instinct she possessed, went inside, entirely alone. The late Duchess's old sitting room held nothing but dust and dim light, but tucked inside a writing desk drawer, beneath a false bottom Clara only discovered because her own father's desk at home had owned an identical one, lay a small bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. They were written in Margaret Ashcombe's own hand, addressed to Sebastian's mother, spanning more than a decade. The earliest were warm and ordinary, gossip, recipes, small complaints about weather and dressmakers. The later ones changed entirely. They spoke, in increasingly bitter terms, of a debt the Ravenshaw family had refused to honor after the fire, a debt Margaret believed had cost her husband his life and her own health far beyond repair. The bloodline that let him die should not continue, one letter read. The pen pressed so hard it had nearly torn through the page. "I will see to it that it does not." There were nearly a dozen letters in the bundle, each charting the same slow descent, grief-curdling letter by letter into something colder and far more deliberate. One, dated only a year before the first Duchess's death, read simply, "You always said this house owed me a debt it would never think to repay honestly. Perhaps it is time I collected it a different way." Clara sat with the letters spread across her knees for a long while, piecing together a decade of careful, patient resentment, and felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the chill of the unused room. Clara heard the door behind her creak before she heard the voice. "You were not supposed to find this room open," said Lady Margaret Ashcombe, standing in the doorway with an expression of perfect, terrible calm. "You were not supposed to wake at all, child. I am beginning to think you are simply very stubborn." The storm that had been building all afternoon broke just as Margaret advanced into the room, and Clara, backing slowly toward the old fireplace, kept her voice as steady as she could manage. "Dr. Holloway never knew, did he?" Clara said. "You told him the tonics came from a specialist in London." "He trusted you, because everyone in this house has always trusted you. Frederick Holloway has always been a sentimental, obedient little man," Margaret said. "He believed exactly what was convenient to believe, as does everyone. Eventually, if one is patient enough, and grieves prettily enough in front of them." And the others wrote it down. Charlotte did. I expect at least one of the others suspected, before the end as well. "Suspicion is not survival," Margaret said, and there was a small vial in her hand now. The same pale glass Clara had refused on her own wedding night, and Margaret's calm had finally cracked into something raw and furious. "You loved Sebastian's mother," Clara said, trying one last time to find some thread of the woman who had written warm, ordinary letters about recipes and weather. "Charlotte wrote that you nursed every bride yourself, out of devotion. Was none of that real in the beginning?" For a moment, something flickered across Margaret's face that might almost have been grief rather than fury. "Every word of it was real. In the beginning, I loved her like my own sister, and I watched her family let mine burn, rather than spend a single shilling settling a dispute they could have ended with an honest apology. Devotion and vengeance are not so different as people like to pretend, child. Both simply mean refusing, ever, to let go. My husband burned alive because a Ravenshaw refused to honor an honest debt, and not one of them so much as attended his funeral." Margaret went on, her voice shaking now. "I decided the name would end with me as witness to it. It very nearly did." She lunged, not gracefully, but with the desperate strength of a woman who had carried this single purpose for 11 years and had nothing left to lose by finishing it. Clara threw the bundle of letters at her face, more from instinct than strategy, and in the half-second of confusion that brought her, the door burst open behind them both. Sebastian had ridden back into the storm because Finch, white-faced, had told him exactly where his wife had gone, and he reached Margaret a full 2 steps before she reached Clara, catching her wrist mid-strike with a grip that left no question of his strength, however gently he had always chosen to use it. "It's finished, Margaret," he said, and for the first time in the entire encounter, his voice was not steady at all. "It is finished." Margaret did not struggle further. She seemed, in the sudden quiet after the storm of her own fury, to deflate entirely, the years of careful composure falling away to reveal something smaller and far more tired underneath. "I only ever wanted someone to understand," she said quietly, "not to either of them in particular. 11 years, and not one person in this family ever asked me how I truly was. They sent flowers. They sent letters of condolence, written by secretaries. No one ever once sat with me and asked. 'I am sorry for your husband,' Sebastian said, and Clara heard, beneath the steel still in his voice, something that sounded almost like genuine grief. 'I am sorry no one in my family ever gave you the apology you deserved, but you have taken 6 innocent lives in exchange for one debt that was never theirs to pay, Margaret. There is no understanding that excuses that.' Margaret said nothing further. She allowed herself to be led from the room without resistance, and Clara, watching her go, felt an unexpected and unwelcome pity settle alongside her relief. The particular sorrow of seeing real grief curdled, slowly and entirely, into something it should never have become. Constables arrived from the village within the hour, summoned by Finch the moment Sebastian had ridden out. Dr. Holloway, brought in for questioning, wept openly when shown the letters, insisting through genuine, broken tears that he had believed every tonic came from a respected London physician's own prescription, never once suspecting the woman who delivered them to his patients' bedsides. The magistrate, reviewing Charlotte's diary alongside Margaret's own letters, found no reasonable doubt left standing anywhere in the case. Lady Margaret Ashcombe was tried that autumn and found guilty on charges that the London papers, with their usual appetite for drama, described in considerably more lurid terms than the courtroom itself ever used. Dr. Holloway, cleared of intent but censured for carelessness, retired quietly from practice and spent his remaining years, by all accounts, considerably more cautious about whose hands he allowed near his patient's medicine. The very papers that had once delighted in calling Sebastian a murderer printed, with notably less enthusiasm, a long series of corrections. The mystery of the warning notes resolved itself quietly, almost shyly, a week after the trial concluded. Hannah Lowe, a young lady's maid who had served Charlotte Pell before her death, came to Clara in the garden, twisting her apron nervously in both hands. "It was me, Your Grace. The notes, and the flower besides, though I never meant the flower as a threat, only as proof that I knew the pattern, in case you needed convincing that someone else did too. I suspected Lady Margaret for years. I had no proof, no standing to accuse a woman of her position, and no one who would have believed a maid's word over a widow the whole house pitied. I am sorry I could not do more." "You did a great deal more than anyone else in this house," Clara said, and meant it entirely. "You believed something was wrong long before anyone with more power than you was willing to look closely enough to see it." Hannah Lowe was given a position as Clara's own attendant within the month, a decision the rest of the household found entirely unsurprising. At Ravenshaw Manor, the East Wing was finally opened properly for the first time in over a decade, aired, cleaned, and turned eventually into a sunlit library, because Clara decided a house should not be made to keep rooms as tombs any longer than absolutely necessary. Charlotte Pell and the other 5 duchesses received, at Clara's quiet insistence, a proper memorial in the chapel garden, with their true stories recorded honestly beside their names at last. William came to live at Ravenshaw the following spring, delighted beyond words by the stables and considerably less delighted by his new tutor's insistence upon Latin verbs. Mary visited often enough that Mrs. Higgins simply began keeping a room aired and ready for her. Violet visited so frequently that the household stopped pretending to be surprised by it, an arrangement she declared, with great satisfaction, long overdue and about time someone admitted it. And Sebastian Ravenshaw, who had spent 7 years believing himself a man cursed to outlive every kindness ever offered to him, learned slowly, patiently, and with no small amount of laughter along the way, that he had simply been waiting for someone clever enough to refuse the tonic and stubborn enough to stay, regardless of what the whole of London whispered. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Sebastian found Clara in the new library, curled into a window seat, with William's latest letter resting in her lap and a small grey cat, adopted, against all household advice, from the stables, asleep against her side. "You look," he said, leaning against the doorframe, "exactly like a woman who has never once spent a single night fearing for her life in this house." "I look," Clara corrected gently, "like a woman who married a man, rumor called a monster, and found instead someone who moves card tables for drafts that do not exist. I should think the rest of London owes you rather a substantial apology." "I find I no longer require London's apology," Sebastian said, crossing the room to sit beside her. "I find I require considerably less from the world than I once believed I did. Only this room, this house, and you within it, refusing tonics and asking the questions no one else thought brave enough to ask aloud. Outside, the late afternoon settled gold and entirely ordinary over the grounds of Ravenshaw Manor, a house that had finally, after 7 long years, stopped being a place people whispered about and become, simply and at last, a home. In the village, where once the church bells had rung only to announce another Ravenshaw funeral, they now rang each spring for an entirely different occasion. A small fair Clara had insisted on establishing, where tenant families and household staff gathered together with no distinction of rank observed at all for one single afternoon each year. William, grown taller and considerably more confident, helped organize the children's races. Mary brought a new bow each year for inspection, much to Violet's open delight and Sebastian's quiet, long-suffering amusement. And on quiet evenings, when the house had settled and the candles had burned low, Sebastian would sometimes find Clara already asleep in the library window seat, and rather than wake her, he would simply sit nearby with a book of his own, content, at long last, to watch someone breathe beside him without counting the hours until dawn. Before we close the final page on this remarkable tale, dear viewers, we ask one last favor of you. If this story has entertained you, moved you, or kept you guessing right up until its final turn, we would be deeply honored if you considered joining our growing community here at Forbidden Palace, with a subscription and a like upon this video. Tell us, if you would, in the comments below, at what moment did you first suspect the true villain hiding within Ravenshaw Manor? And which of our characters would you most wish to sit across from at supper, given the chance? Your comments, your theories, and your company are what make these evenings so worthwhile, and for every single one of them, we remain truly and sincerely grateful. So ends the tale of the Duke, whose brides never lived to see the morning, until one courageous, clever young woman declined a cup of wine and changed the fate of an entire household in the process. The guilty answered, in full, for what she had done. The innocent were, at long last, believed. The lonely found each other, and the broken found their way, slowly and patiently, toward mending. Let us remember, dear viewers, that fear too often wears the face of the wrong person entirely, that truth is patient, even when justice moves slowly, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply refuse to drink what they are told to drink, and ask one more honest question instead. Until our paths cross again, may your evenings be peaceful, your curiosity well rewarded, and your stories always worth the telling. Farewell, dear friends, and thank you, as always, for visiting Forbidden Palace. Moral and educational takeaways. Reputation is not evidence. Sebastian was condemned by gossip for 7 years before anyone investigated the actual facts of his case, a reminder that public opinion, however confident, can be entirely wrong. Grief that is never properly addressed can curdle, over time, into something destructive. Margaret's pain was genuine. What she chose to do with it became the deeper tragedy within the larger one. Quiet courage matters more than dramatic heroics. Clara's bravery was built from small, steady choices, asking honest questions, refusing the tonic, and trusting her own careful judgment over comfortable assumptions. Trust should be earned through consistent pattern and evidence, not simply inherited through long acquaintance or social standing, as the household had wrongly extended to Lady Margaret for years. Old debts, whether financial or emotional, left unresolved and unspoken, have a way of resurfacing with consequences far larger than their original size. A household, a family, or a person can be unfairly judged by rumor alone. Real understanding only comes from patience, honest investigation, and a willingness to look past first impressions.